Stampers Kim from stampingandperfection.com. Thanks for joining me today. I want to share a card that I'm going to make with some Altenew stamps. I have two stamp sets, Forever and Always and Peony Spray, and I'm going to use those for the Peony Spray for the sentiment and the Forever and Always for the image. And you can see here I'm using some Versamark ink. I'm going to use some of Altenew's antique gold embossing powder, and I'm using Canson XL watercolor paper here. This is cold pressed paper, 140-pound paper, and I'm stamping it a couple times with the Versamark because there is some texture to that cardstock, and I really want to get a good stamped image. So I'm putting my embossing powder on, and I'm grabbing a piece of scrap paper, and then I'm just going to pour this out. Tap it off a little bit, and I'm not worried at all that I have it around the outside there, that it's a little messy, because I'm going to use this Forever and Always stamp set from Altenew has a coordinating die, so I'm going to use that die and cut it out. I'm going to pop that up when I'm done on some foam tape and give it a lot of dimension, so I'm really enjoying that. So I love using my Misty tool, because when I stamp on watercolor paper, I like to do it 2 or 3 times with Versamark, or even with regular, like a regular black stamp pad, and it really does allow you to get a nice image. So I'm just heating up my heat tool here, and I always start with the back, because the watercolor paper is super thick, so I like to heat up the back of the paper and warm it up a little bit, and then heat up the front, because you really have to heat for a while to get it heat set on watercolor paper. And one of the things I learned from one of the Tim Holtz classes that I took, he said, hold your paper up, don't leave it laying on your surface, because when you leave it laying on your surface, you're actually heating up the surface along with the paper, and it takes a lot longer. So I really wanted a nice shiny metallic surface or image here, because I'm going to enter this in a card challenge, and it's the whole theme of the challenge is flowers and shiny, so I'm using that pretty antique gold. Now I've taken out my distress markers, and I've only had these about a month or so I'm trying all different kinds of techniques. The technique I'm using here, and this is, by the way, mustard seed marker. I'm just putting I'm just creating the where I want the darker shades. I'm just putting direct to paper with that marker, and just sort of going along the bottom edges of all the petals and the center of the petals. And then I pulled out a couple of round paint brushes. The first one I started with was the number 2, but I didn't feel like I had a lot of control with that. It was too long. The brush felt too long for getting in those small places. So then I pulled out the 0 round brush, and I liked that a lot better. And I'm wetting down that brush, and I'm trying to keep it dark toward the bottom and just lighten out. So I'm like pulling the color out of those edges with water. And I wanted it to be a little darker, but since the paper was wet, I really couldn't I couldn't really get more color added on while that image was wet. So I took my paintbrush and just wet the paintbrush and touched it along the tip and pulled some color directly off the tip of that marker, and then added it, and I liked that a lot better. So I'm doing the same thing with the next one. And I'm not really worrying about shadows and where the sun is coming from, and that's for really more advanced watercolorists or Copic marker colorists. I just want to get it so it looks like I have some dark spots and light spots, and that there's some color variation. That's really all I want to do. I'm keeping it simple. I'm just trying to play around and see what I can do with these markers in different ways. So today I'm just playing with this technique, using it directly on the paper and then wetting a brush and pulling the color out. And I actually really like this, because with watercolor, because these are dye-based markers, so with water-based markers like this, they dissolve in water, and I can add more water to my brush and actually pull color off in spots. So again, I'm going to just take that wet brush and pull some more color off to get it darker in a couple places. And another thing I can do is I can let this dry and then come back and add more color, and then bring in my wet paintbrush and, pull it out again. And you can see I'm lifting a little of the color off there, wetting down my brush. So that's water I have in that white container at the top of the desk, and I'm just trying to get more color on there. So I just play around with this. Now this happens to be abandoned coral. I really love this abandoned coral color. I think it's just so pretty. And I'm also going to use broken china on this. I'm going to use peeled paint. I'll use the black soot marker, and I'm also going to use the gathered twigs marker. But unfortunately here I'm just adding to the base of all the leaves and buds that look like they're still closed. I'm just adding some of that peeled paint, and I'm going to pull that down into it just like I did before. And then I'm going to use the broken china on that one last big bud there. And I'm going to also add some candied apple to make those other little floral images, or I'm not quite sure what they are, but I'm going to make those look like they're berries with that candied apple marker too. So, because in a minute my camera battery dies, and I apologize for that. So you're going to miss some of the coloring, but you get the idea of what I'm doing here. And I just finish this off. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish this off and just color everything. And this is actually a really relaxing technique if you have not tried this. So here's what it ended up looking like when I got all done, and I was pretty happy with it for my first try at this technique with these particular markers. I've done this with other markers before, but then I used my Big Shot. I cut out the image with the coordinating die, the Forever and Always coordinating die. Now I'm just cutting my card base, and I'm cutting a card base at 4¼ by 11. I'm going to come back and score it at 5½, and here I'm having a little trouble deciding whether I want to put that floral image directly on the card base, or do I want to have a card panel. I decided to go with the card panel because I really like the way it looks when you have a card popped up on some foam tape, and I love having that dimension on the card. And I really am enjoying the white on white technique lately, with the white mat on top of the white card base. And there you can see I scored it at 5½. I'm gonna use my Teflon bone folder. I love this Teflon bone folder, and just score that fold. I love the way you get a professional image. So this is the broken china. I'm scribbling some of that onto my craft mat. If you don't have a craft mat, you can use a piece of plastic, like the plastic envelopes that the stamps come in, or you can use your clear block. So I'm adding some water, and I just want a water wash background. And actually this looks brighter blue than it looks in person, but now I'm noticing that even though I didn't put a ton of water, it's pilling up on this paper. So I thought I would try the marker, but this is not working. So I'm getting rid of this. I'm going to go and use a piece of Canson watercolor paper. So it's going to be a little creamy white on white, but again, I'm cutting this down to 4 by 5¼ and I'm going to redo this with that broken china marker and the water. This is such a great technique with dye-based markers. You just scribble it on, you add a little water, and the more water you add, the lighter the color, and you just scribble it on the background. And it's so subtle. Like, this is a very subtle color. This looks really pretty with gray. It looks really pretty with, a really light brown, like the frayed burlap or the old paper distress marker would be super pretty. But I'm using the flower, so excuse me. So I'm trying it on my clear block because I wanted it a little darker, and I gave it a little bit less water. And I realized I need to cover more of that paper because the bloom I created is really much larger than I expected. And so I'm cleaning up. The nice thing about using dye-based ink is that you can just wash up with water. Like that, everything cleans up with water because it's soluble in water. So I'm just going to heat this a little bit so I can go on to the next step. And it's very subtle, that background. Again, I heat the back of my paper. That helps keep it from like curling too much. And just checking the size there with that um, bloom that I die cut, that Forever and Always bloom. So I'm pulling out my black soot. This is my favorite Distress Oxide color, and this is actually just Distress ink, but I love making splatters with this stuff. Cannot make enough splatters. I pull out, notice that this is a much bigger brush. This brush is actually my round 10. The 8 and the 10 are my favorite ones to watercolor with. As a fairly new watercolor person, I really find that I get more control with a larger brush than I do with those little detail brushes, and I'm much more comfortable. I'm just splattering an extra piece of paper here because why not create a second background with that piece that I cut off, the other half of the paper, and have that ready to go for another project. I love that technique, but that's my favorite one to splatter with because I get the nicest splatters with that black soot, and especially with the Distressed Oxide ink pad. So and pull out this again, and those splatters are still wet, and I have a habit of actually like moving on to before they're dry, so I don't want to do that because I smudge them a lot. I'll smudge one or two of them, which is okay because they're splatters, but I also noticed I also added some splatters to my floral image, and I'm going to heat that a tiny bit, but I don't want to heat it enough that it affects my embossing, because that embossing powder can remelt, and it takes the shine away. And since pardon my head there, since the challenge I'm entering is a floral challenge with shiny elements, I want to keep it shiny. So this 3M foam tape is my new favorite adhesive for popping, creating dimension on my cards. And I probably said this in videos before, but I got like 2 or 3 rolls of this stuff, and they're ginormous, from an electrical supply company on Amazon. And it was a lot less expensive than buying them through craft companies. I was surprised. I don't know, maybe I just got a sale. And now I want some white splatters too on my flowers. So I'm pulling out my gel pen, my white gel pen. And I have several different kinds of gel pens. I don't have a favorite yet. And I think this is, I can't remember what this is. It's the Jelly Roll 10. This is actually a really nice one. So I put a few white splatters, which you can't see, but I do really like that they're on there. I think that looks really pretty. Sometimes I like to actually get some white embossing powder and put that on randomly with an embossing fluid pen. So I'm putting a lot of foam tape on the back of that because I really don't want this to curl. Before I try to stick it on, I'm just checking the size because I can't seem to cut anything straight lately, even with a trimmer. I think it's time for new glasses, but now I'm going to put this down. And that background is so subtle, but it adds so much to the card. I don't know why. Sometimes I don't want a background, but with watercolor, why not? It's that watercolor wash background is so pretty. So you can see I popped that up on foam tape, and I really like this. I realize that someone who's been watercoloring a long time, or someone who's really good with Copic markers, is probably looking at the shading and the shadow with, horrified, but I really like that technique. I will definitely use this again. So I'm pulling out a sentiment from the Peony spray stamp set. I've used this stamp set so much. This again is from Altenew. And I'm going to use Create Your Own Happiness because I want a subtle um, sentiment on there. And I'm just pulling one of those little strips of paper that I cut off the edge because this is super thin. It's like not even a quarter of an inch, this sentiment. And I just want it to be subtle. I spent enough time on that bloom that I want to show off the technique. So I'm going to make it this very subtle and put it on top. And again, it's the challenge is to add shiny elements to the card. So I'm going to emboss this and that Altenew antique gold. And this little mini Misty is my favorite tool to use to get my sentiments as straight as I can possibly get them. So I ink it up in Versamark ink. I pull out some scrap paper, pour on that rose gold, and this is very pretty. Or this is actually antique gold, but their rose gold is very pretty also. Um, so I'm just, taking care of this, and I'm going to heat set this. And again, I always start on the back. I'm off camera here, but I start on the back because I learned in one of the classes that I took that if you heat the back first, it actually will heat it up enough that when you go to like flip over to the front, you won't lose a bunch of the powder because some heat guns actually will blow off a little bit of the powder. Now I'm just going to put some foam tape on the edges of this so that the part going over the center of the floral image isn't popped way up because I've already got a lot of dimension on the card. So I just want to prop up the edges that aren't like sitting on top of the flower. And I really like this gold sentiment on top of that skinny white paper, white cardstock that's just a scrap strip ordinarily I would throw away. And these beautiful little skinny sentiments that the stamp companies are including in all the stamp sets now. Like a lot of times I'll use it as a secondary sentiment with like a die cut script word, or they have larger sentiments that I'll include and then, heat emboss one of these on a little strip of paper and pop it up with some dimension. So having a secondary sentiment on a card is really fun, but I'm going to use what was probably intended to be a secondary sentiment as my primary sentiment. Now, again, it's shiny and I have been loving my bling lately. So I'm pulling out some metallic sequins. This is like a combination pack, but since I used the antique gold embossing powder from Altenew, I just want to use gold sequins. Like this is a mix from Stampin' Up that I've had for quite a while, and it's got black, and it's got iridescent white, and it's got some silver. I just want the gold. And I never used to use sequins, but now I use them all the time. And I started using them after I took a class with someone. The class was called Beautiful Details, and she really did so many different techniques to create beautiful details. But when she put her sequins on, she said that she tries to create triangles. So I love that advice. It made it easier to actually put them on. She also said that you kind of want to go across an element in your card, like put two on one side of the sentiment and the third one on the other side of the sentiment. Here I'm actually going to put a triangle of 3 on the lower left and then a triangle of 3 on the upper right. So it kind of flows across the whole card, and I really like that. I thought that was such good advice. She also said sometimes she wants it to look really organic, so she'll just take a few and just sprinkle them over the top of the card and then she'll glue them down where they land, which I think is very brave. So I love this quick stick. that has some kind of like sticky clay or something on the bottom, and when it gets icky, I just peel it off, and then um, the bottom piece turns and squeezes out a little bit more clay, and you can use it many, many, many times. I've had that for over a year, and I use it every day, and that is multimedia matte glue. I love that stuff. I put a special applicator tip on, and that's going to complete my card. Um, Thank you so much for watching. Stop by my blog at stampingimperfection.com. I will link to the Altenew products below.